Welcome, Lauren. When we had Charlotte Wood as an interviewee, I did a land acknowledgement, and I'd like to do it again today, in part because I think it's an important practice, in part because of the topic of the vaster wilds, and in part because I'm Australian. So I start by acknowledging First Nations people, both in Australia and in the United States, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I acknowledge that we are meeting on unceded land, and I pay my respects to all First Nations people, past and present. And as you've heard me say before, as a literary historian, as an intellectual historian, one of the reasons that it's important to do land acknowledgements is to keep an awareness that throughout the period of European literary history that we are speaking about and that I write about and that Lauren has written about in The Vaster Wilds, First Nations cultures and lifeways are coexistent in the places that we're writing about and that we're speaking about today. I'm speaking from Lenape lands in New York. Many of the listeners are on Lenape land in New Jersey. Now I'd like to give a short introduction to Lauren, who truly needs no introduction. She is a three-time National Book Award finalist. She is a New York Times best-selling author of many novels, The Monsters of Templeton, Arcadia, Fates and Furies, Matrix, and The Vaster Wilds, and celebrated short story collections, Delicate Edible Birds, and Florida. She is also the owner of an extraordinary bookstore in Gainesville, Florida, The Lynx, which I've never personally been to, but one of my closest friends goes there often. She says it's an incredible, magical place. Having the Lynx, and I want to ask Lauren about this, I think is more than just a bookstore. It's an activist move. It's a utopian move in a time of book bans and other grave problems across our world. So we're excited to talk about the vast wilds and also to talk about the Lynx. Welcome, Lauren.
It's so wonderful to be here. I were with you, but this is second best.
Yeah,
Thank you.
this is good too. And it's enormously generous of you. You are hugely busy and you are very kind to be speaking to us. Lauren, we spoke last year at the Sydney Writers' Festival, and I would love to kind of go back to some of the big questions about writing colonial and post-colonial stories that we spoke about in that conversation. And I would like us to start in the colony of Virginia, where the Vaster Wilds is set. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the major problems and conflicts that you thought of as shaping your characters' lives in the novel. Of course, the girl herself, but actually also the social world that she's coming from in that text.
Oh, absolutely. So, uh, Jamestown, which is what I was writing about, was the first permanent English settlement in in North America. There were failed experiments before, and there was a sense of desperation actually when people first came over. I think what people were dealing with was kind of an appalling list of suffering, right? And of self-inflicted suffering as well. There is an extremely rigid class structure that a lot of the Jamestown people adhered to, so that gentlemen just never worked, which in a colony is unsustainable, absolutely in every single
Mm.
way. And that led to a lot of really deep problems, class wise and otherwise. Um, and then they were met with their own arrogance, right? The feeling like they were entitled to the land, and the Powhatan who were there already said, "No, this is our land," right? And then there were trading issues, and the colonists went out and just murdered people, and there was malaria, smallpox, all sorts of horrific diseases, so many that about 83% of the colonists who came ended up dying. And there was a long period of time called the starving time,
Mm.
where so many people died. And in fact, one of the impetuses for this book was I was in a dentist's office, and I was looking, I have OCD, so I actually can't, I have a hard time touching things that other people have visibly
Mm.
touched. And this is just an issue that I deal with. And the Smithsonian magazine was still in his plastic wrapper, so I felt like I could read it. So I opened it and I read this a beautiful article about Jamestown, and in it, I discovered that archaeologists had just disinterred the bones of a 14-year-old girl on which there were very clear markers of butchery, which
Mm.
meant that she had been eaten, right? Eaten by the
Mm.
settlers, which was not the American history that, of course, I was taught in high
Mm.
school, elementary school, college, right? This goes against a lot of the heroic foundational
Yeah.
narratives, right?
Yeah.
That we were given. And so, it's just such a fascinating time. Anytime that there is a frontier, there is
Mm.
just a really deep and powerful and fascinating story to be told, or many, many stories to be told.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's such a good account. And one of the things that I was thinking a lot about, especially rereading the book for this week, is this question of starvation, which we think of in some sense as a condition that is imposed on people. It's obviously involuntary. No one wants to be starving. Um, and I was thinking about how starvation is itself a condition that's sort of been shaped by colonial activity. I mean, first of all, the colonists are starving because they are trying to plant a new colony and it's not working. But there's a lot of scholarship that suggests that, part of what went wrong in these early colonial experiments is that Europeans simply didn't understand how to manage hunger. They didn't understand how to manage a relationship with land and with scarcity in ways that could work. And one of the most striking scenes, I think, in the novel is of the Native American people not starving
Mhm.
and having resources and knowledge that enabled them to sort of interact with land, have a relationship with land that was sustaining even during scarcity. Was that something that you were aware of when you were writing?
Oh yes, yeah, and of course I have, a bibliography 100 books deep, if not more. And this was one of these beautiful things where, just looking at the stark difference between indigenous populations and their ability to understand the land and to
Mm,
sort of react to the way that scarcity happens cyclically,
mm,
as opposed to the Europeans belief that they could impose European ideas of cultivation, et cetera, on land that they didn't know, right? And there were actually some settlers who were not so arrogant that they couldn't learn from the native population. There just weren't that many of them.
yeah.
And John Smith was not one of them. Right? Like, I hate John Smith so much.
Yeah.
He's horrific. But so you go back in time and you sort of you see, because retrospect is clearer eyed than being in the
Yeah.
moment. It really was this idea of natural superiority, right? That
Mm,
the colonists just could not see through, even to save their own lives. Yeah.
yeah. So I'd love to think together for a few minutes about historical fiction and, the work it's doing right now. You've obviously been writing historical fiction now for some time. I'm thinking about when did the Matrix when did I keep calling it the Matrix? When did Matrix come out?
Oh gosh, I don't even know.
Some time ago.
2020.
Okay. So
Yeah,
pre-COVID, actually. That's interesting.
yeah, I think so.
Um, so clearly this is a mode that you've been working in before the really major crisis, really major, very visible crises kicked in, like the pandemic, and then the current re-election of Trump. Although I suppose you were writing after the first election of Trump. And so I was wondering if we could think together a bit about the relationship of the historical to the present, and
Mhm.
particularly whether, since you started writing historical fiction
Mhm.
to now,
Mhm.
your feelings about the purpose of the historical have changed at all.
Oh, radically. Yeah. So actually, when I was a young writer in my early 20s, before I went to graduate school, that was a time when historical fiction was really seen as almost shameful, right? Because
Mm,
of, I guess, the Fabioization of
Yes. Yes, it's sort of bodice rippers
a
and
lot
all
of
that
bodice
stuff.
rippers.
Although bodice ripping's way back in, I feel like. But
I
yeah,
know everybody loves bodice ripping
yeah,
now.
yeah.
Maybe not, literary fiction. Oh, I don't know. All fours is pretty bodice ripping.
Yeah, it's a real bodice ripper. That's
Yeah,
a good
it's
description
very
of it, actually.
in an
Yeah.
incredible way. Yeah. But I have to say, I thought of it with some shame actually, because I was always drawn to writing historical fiction, but at the time, really, the only people doing it in literary fiction who were sort of elevated for doing it were Andrea Barrett and then
Mm.
Jim Shepard, right? Who are amazing, and I love them very much. Short story writers. I think I was handed uh, scorn by the school of Henry James, who, of course, very famously hated historical fiction. He wrote this horrific letter to Sarah Orne Jewett, in which, after she had shown him a draft of a historical fiction, he basically excoriated it, saying, you cannot write historical fiction because we can't get into the mindset of the people of the time, and therefore it's a lie from the beginning.
Mm.
And I completely recommend looking it up online. If I ever got something like
It
that
is an
from,
extraordinary
oh,
sort of polemical statement. Yeah, yeah.
imagine getting it,
I
right?
know. I sort of feel like Henry James, writers come and go in terms of fashion. I feel like Henry James is not looking that great at
I
this
know.
particular moment.
He always looks great. I love him
Yeah,
so much. But
yeah.
he was prissy. But the thing that I love about him is that he was opinionated, and he
Mm.
really, like, he stuck to those opinions, and
Yeah,
some of them have been proven to be wrong.
yeah, yeah. Or at least sort of very organized by his own historical moment, I suppose.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's a very good way of saying that. So
yeah,
true. Yeah.
yeah.
I had to get over myself, and my first novel has some historical elements that I had so much fun with. And I realized over the course of these past, 20 years in which I've been
Mm,
writing seriously, historical fiction is one of these incredible tools
mm,
that we don't give enough credit to,
mm.
because you're almost being like a throat singer. You're singing in two voices at once, because there's no such thing as ahistorical fiction. All fiction is written in the moments, right?
Mm.
Even if it's set 4,000 years from now, you're really writing about your contemporary day. You may not understand that you are, but you really are, right? And the thing about fiction too is that it's inherently time traveling, right? You're always writing for the future, right? Into the
Yes,
future. You're writing for a
yes.
future reader, and you're drawing on the past, right? So this is incredible technology that has yet to be surpassed, I believe, in which you can actually bring all time periods together in one
Mm.
object that travels through time and changes through time, right? So it's beautiful, right? It's a structure made of time and words.
Oh, wow. What a great way of putting it.
Oh God, I love it so much. And so historical fiction I've come to see as this unbelievable thing that we can use in order to really condemn, or really to inculpate ourselves,
Mm.
and to really question the present moment and how we got here. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I've been thinking, so believe it or not, Matrix and the Vaster Wilds and this third book I wrote
Mm.
all at the same time, um, to sort of skip over 1,000 years of history to sort of understand how we got here in the Anthropocene.
Yes.
Um, and I was on this panel with Jeff Vandermeer, whom I love very much. He's another Florida writer. He's brilliant, and
He's a brilliant writer. Yeah.
he's a brilliant writer of mostly, sci-fi fantasy
Yeah.
sort of genre. He's unbelievably great. But he was, we had this giant argument on stage when we both got very passionate. But he said the only way to write about the Anthropocene is writing into the future. And I said,
Mm.
no, right? Historical fiction can give us a way of writing about the Anthropocene by tracing how we got to where we are.
That is really fascinating. And one of the connections that I'm making as you're speaking is I was doing an interview last week with an Australian writer, Anna Funder, who wrote a counter biography of George Orwell's wife and sort of
Yes.
reinserting her back into the story of George Orwell. I was asking her about 1984, George Orwell's great futuristic um, manifesto. And I was saying, isn't it amazing that it was such a predictive text? And she was saying it wasn't predictive, it was analytical. And that, basically, if you are thoughtful and analytical enough about any present, you're always seeing both the past and the future in that moment. And I was really thinking about that rereading Vaster Wilds. And the direction I'd love to take us in now with that is the sense in which Vaster Wilds sort of has that predictive quality, which is also just analysis of the past, that precarity, isolation, illness, the threat of catastrophe are always what shapes this one sense of being an individual. And I wondered if you could reflect on that, for now.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I have been told in the past. So my 2011 book, Arcadia,
Mm.
which I wrote before 2011, had in 2019 a global pandemic in it called SARS, and it
Wow.
was very much like COVID. And so I have to say, and people are like, "How did you know?" And actually, at the time that the book came out, it was roundly sort of critiqued for not being realistic. That there
Mm.
would not be a pandemic like this; it wouldn't affect us like this.
Oh, you got to be patting yourself on the back about that.
I'm a little bit, right? Like
Yeah.
it's but I have to say, right? So if you pay attention to history, right? If you see the way that humans act in cyclical ways and forget the past in cyclical ways, you're
Mm.
going to see where we're going to be here. So I also, I'm a very anxious person. I have a great deal of anxiety. And I've always been deeply attracted to survivalist stories, especially in the Anthropocene, right?
Mm.
Because in the past, huge human projects, which have been on the cusp of failure, have been saved by nature. But what do we do if nature is the
Mm.
thing that is being undermined, right?
Mm.
Like, so, traditional American right-wing survivalism is just like, we'll just hole up on our compound in nature and shoot people and,
Yeah.
gardens, right?
Yeah.
What if the gardens fail, right?
Mm.
What if the climate has been so destroyed that this can't happen? So this is an anxiety that has lived in me for a very long time.
Mm.
I've reacted to it by building a library of survivalist texts, which I know nothing about, but I know where the books are. Right? So that,
Fascinating.
yeah.
What's
So
your top two survivalist narratives for the
of
survivalists out there?
narratives,
Yeah.
yeah. So The Road by Cormac
Yep.
McCarthy, which I made a horrific mistake of reading when I was pregnant with my first
Oh
son.
yeah, big mistake.
Don't do it. Don't
No,
do it.
no.
No. Anyway,
I
and then
slightly can't deal with that book even when I'm not pregnant.
I know,
Just a bit,
I
a
know.
bit
Oh
bad.
no, that
Yeah,
it ruins me for years.
yeah.
And then I actually think Robinson Crusoe, which is one of the foundational texts for this book, The
Mm.
Vast Files, right? Because um, I don't know, I just I love the way that um, Crusoe embodies um, the ideal Englishman of the
Yeah,
time,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
without perhaps even any like Defoe actually understanding what he was doing. I'm sure he did, but
I
also
don't know that he did actually. I think it's so fascinating that Defoe came up with this sort of fully formed novelistic model sort of out of nowhere. I mean, he
yeah,
was just like, oh, I'm just going to cobble this together. Yeah, it is so interesting. One, we talked about Robinson Crusoe earlier in the week when we were doing the lecture, and one of the things that I was thinking about with it, in relation to the Vaster Wilds, because I knew that you were influenced by it. I was thinking about the way in which sort of the trick that Defoe, I suppose, is playing in Robinson Crusoe with all the detail about, pot making and crop planting and goat shooting and all that stuff. It's giving us this template of extremity and, the need to survive actually does lead to survival. It leads to a certain kind of thriving, which is then becomes this template for realist fiction. And it's what happens in Crusoe, but it's also what happens beyond Crusoe, so that when we see someone struggling in fiction, we assume that it is a precursor to their survival and their thriving. And one
Mm.
of the things that I found very moving about the Vaster Wilds, I suppose it's the whole point of the book, is that the heroine's non-survival is itself a certain kind of, I don't want to say thriving, but it's a certain kind of relinquishing of individuality to a bigger picture of survival and life. And the end of the book to me is so moving in that way because you describe this immense life going on, even as she sort of relinquishes her life to it. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk about that in relation to climate crisis and your own sense of, you know, how we as mothers, as people in this moment can think about survival.
Oh yeah. Oh, I love that you read that like that because that was exactly my intention, and
Oh,
it's not
good.
always read that way. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So um, you, as a mother, right? You bring into life these humans that you know are going to die one day.
Mm,
Right? I mean, being a human on this planet is a utopian experiment.
mm, mm.
Just surviving, just bringing new people into the world is utopian, which doesn't mean that we know that it's going to fail, but we do it anyway, right? Because it's hope, right? And it's beautiful in and of itself, and it's noble in and of itself. I actually think utopian experiments, even though they're destined to fail, are the most noble things that we can do.
Mm.
Um, so in terms of uh, this particular narrative, I wanted to think about like a greater kind of survival beyond the physical, right? I mean, I think that this is what frontier narratives have taught us, and I wanted to unlearn it. I wanted the
Mm.
experience of this book to be an experience of unlearning civilization, or the narratives that are untrue about civilization, so that even though she is materially disintegrating over the course of the book, she's anagogically um, rising, right? I mean, she's becoming more understanding of the greater world, of the world beyond the human, the sort of the false hierarchies in which we have all been in the Western world raised, in which man is the closest to the ear of God,
Mm.
and honestly, it's man because women is subordinate,
Yeah,
right in this,
yeah.
right. So I wanted to collapse that, radically collapse that, so that as she's going through the book, she's losing the sense of civilization as being the highest thing, and she's starting to see the godliness in the worm, right? The
Yeah,
godliness in the bear, in the squirrel, even though she eats them,
yeah,
like
yeah,
these
yeah,
things are equal to her.
yeah.
Really necessary, I think. For me, the urgency of this book is
Mm.
this collapse in hierarchy.
Yes.
Right, this collapse in the idea of the human being the central idea on this planet, because it's not. I
Right.
mean, there will be life beyond us, and this is
Yes.
the most beautiful things that I have learned recently. But my younger son, who's 14, told me this. But apparently, there are these Japanese researchers who are drilling as deeply as possible into the earth, and at every level they find life. And that moves me so profoundly,
Mm.
right? Because it means that no matter what,
Yeah.
when this utopian experiment of being human fails, which it will,
Mm.
there will still be life. And I think
Yeah.
life is beautiful, right? Life is
Yeah.
worth it. Life is worthy. And I'm getting emotional because, I think often we think of the tragedy befalling the self-imposed tragedy befalling humans,
Mm.
and it breaks us, right?
Yes.
And it makes us almost too sad to act,
Sort of carry
um,
on.
to
And
carry on.
I think that the frontier, I love that point you make about undoing frontier narratives, because frontier narratives present themselves as humans in a kind of adversarial relationship to boundary, to unknownness, to uncertainty of all kinds. That is what a frontier is. It's an unknown.
Mhm.
And it's something that I particularly took away from the Vaster Wilds on rereading it this time around is the distinction between the other settlers, very adversarial relationship to their own starvation, which of course culminates in them eating another human. And I don't even particularly judge them for that, but they sort of do it in a mean way. And then the girls, you know, very unjudgmental, unadversarial relationship to her own relationship, both to survival and non-survival. And I felt in your depiction of Native American practice in the book that that same dynamic was coming through. It's not that they were winning or they were surviving or whatever, but that the relationship to survival and non-survival, it's just an entirely different sense of the human's place in this sort of world of being. And I was wondering, with the new work that you're doing now, are those persisting ideas? Are you trying to grapple again with these questions of being human in a universe, I suppose, where it's absolutely essential that we not center the human?
Yes. I'm trying very hard, but of course, every book tells you what it wants.
Yeah.
And this book is really tricky. I've been working on it. So I actually wrote all three of the books at once. I
Oh,
did
wow. So it's done.
oh no, because I've been rewriting it. This is
Okay.
what I do. This is my process, right? I
Okay.
rewrite everything infinitely
Yeah.
until it makes me want to vomit. It's like too much.
Yeah.
But no, the first drafts, the early drafts of all three of the books were done in 2019, and so I've
Mm.
been rewriting it for 6 years now. Um, and it's still not finished, and I don't know if it ever will be, which is completely fine. It's
Mm.
about sort of the discovery of what the book actually needs. So yes, I am trying to write about the decentering of humans. I think it's a narrative that is so urgent.
Mm.
Like we need to break the narratives in which we've been living, right?
Mm.
They enclosed us. They are cages
Mm.
that we don't even see. And if we don't learn from people like Robin Wall Kimmerer, right? If we
Yes.
don't learn from people with indigenous
Who,
identity.
just to break in, the students may or may not know, is a wonderful writer. She wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, and she has a new book. Is it called Winter? It's not called Winterberry.
Serviceberry, I think.
Serviceberry. That's right. And it's very much about these interrupting human narratives. Go on.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, right. If we don't do this, we will kill ourselves,
Yeah.
right? Out of sheer blind, or not blind, but sheer ignorance, to be perfectly honest, right?
Yeah.
Willful ignorance. So I
Yeah.
think we are very, very urgent to listen to the people who are not of the Western canon, right? The
Mm.
people who have a different way of seeing the world and retelling those stories as opposed to retelling,
Mm.
Robinson Crusoe,
Mm.
right? Which I
Yeah.
love, but telling
Yeah.
it is undermining it. It's
Yeah.
good to undermine these
Yeah.
narratives.
Or telling it slant, I suppose, as
Yeah.
Emily Dickinson
Yeah.
said. Yeah. So to pivot for a second to book ownership life in Florida, do these questions of sort of utopianism, to some extent, being what's the word? I don't want to say exceptional. Actually, I want to say unusual group of people in a state where not everybody thinks alike. A state also that is uniquely uh, sort of aware of climate change and climate impact, let's
Mm-hmm.
say, even
Mm-hmm.
if we don't say change. Um, what is that? Yeah, how is your utopian experiment going?
Oh, it's super utopian, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I think ultimately, if things keep going in the authoritarian direction, uh, I'm thinking I probably will be arrested because I just won't comply, right? I mean, if there's a bill moving through the Florida Senate right now that would limit the sale of obscene materials to minors. But of course, they're trying to take away from the Miller. I don't want to get into the weeds,
Mm.
but they're trying to sort of like loosen the definition of what obscenity is,
Yeah.
which would mean that we wouldn't be able to sell books to kids,
Yeah.
which is so devastating. And I will never not sell a book to children.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
won't do it, right?
Yeah.
So they will probably be arresting me, and
Wow.
I don't care. right?
Yeah.
Because there's I think we all need to learn from what's going on right now that we do not have to comply with
Mm,
politics, right?
mm.
Um, uh, Even if it means that
Yeah.
I go to jail, I don't
Yeah.
care.
Yeah.
Um, so it's going great.
Great.
Right?
It
What
sounds good. Yeah.
we're meeting these people who want to pull narratives that are necessary for many
Mm,
people's lives out of their hands, and we're meeting them with more narratives that are necessary, right? We have a nonprofit also that has so far given away $40,000 worth of banned books to
mm,
Floridians, and most of these books are LGBTQI plus. Most of them are they center Black people or
mm,
brown people,
mm,
indigenous. A lot of them have like the word sex in them. There's also Good Night Moon, which has been banned because of an image of a naked bunny. Right. There's also Othello, which has been banned because there's a Black person at the center of it. Right.
mm,
There's Toni Morrison, whose work, our great Nobel laureate,
mm,
whose work has been banned because she's Black, right? And she talks
mm,
about Black things.
mm.
So like, it's just offensive to my spirit and soul that this
Yeah.
is even happening. So we're
Yeah.
fighting back in every way that we possibly can.
It's really wonderful that you have that platform to do it. And I was thinking as you were speaking and saying, we have no choice other than not to comply. And, I certainly think, how can, or I don't certainly, I do try to think, how can I, from a position of privilege, not comply? In other words, how can we use privilege right now not to comply in certain ways?
Mhm.
Um, and at the same time, I've been, more aware than usual of people where they sort of have to comply. Like, their survival depends on compliance. And do you find people in the bookshop, I suppose, or readers generally, where you're aware of this idea that it is actually risky for them to keep reading, to think about not sort of just fitting in with the demands of our political and social moment? Is that something that comes through the door at the bookshop? Is it
Not
is it an
yet.
awareness? Yeah.
I think, we get a lot of public librarians, public school teachers who have felt profoundly pressured to take a lot of these books ahead of time off their shelves.
Yeah.
And if there's anything we can tell them, and we do all the time, it's don't take those books off the shelves, right?
Yeah.
Just because there's a threat in the future doesn't mean
Mm,
that you have to comply in advance,
mm.
right? Doesn't mean that you have to actually like not teach mouse if you're teaching the Holocaust, because in other school districts it's banned, right?
Mouse
I'm,
has
I'm
been bad. I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, mouse is everything. Every
Mm,
good book has been banned.
mm.
Like there are over 4,000 books in the state of Florida that have been challenged or banned, and
Mouse, for the listeners, is a graphic novel about Holocaust featuring, are they rats or mice? I can't remember.
mice. Yeah, they're
Mice.
mice.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. So what I feel this, right? I think that readers I think that the book is inherently a revolutionary technology,
Mm.
especially in the time of screen technology,
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
right? Because the physical codex can be passed from hand to hand, right? The paper codex is something that can go under scrutiny,
Mm.
can be like disseminated widely, without people really tracking you down, because they're tracking your screen. They're tracking
That's so
Meta's tracking.
interesting. Yeah,
So I do think that it's always been revolutionary, and bookshops
yeah.
have always been revolutionary, right?
Mm.
Bookshops have always been spaces
Yes,
of pushing the boundaries within the system, right? Because we are
yes,
within the capitalist system.
yes,
And that gives us certain protections, right? Because we're a small business and Republicans love business. So
yes.
we're trying to work both within and without the system in order to sort of to break the system.
Yeah. I love that point about about the codex, about a printed object, or previously even a manuscript object, uh, being in some way untraceable. It's a real paradox, actually, isn't it? That the fact that it has a material life in the world makes it less trackable than a screen with its digital footprint and its digital life. And I actually hadn't thought about that at all. But in preparing to talk to you today, I was thinking about licensing and book bans in history and how important it has been for revolutionary writers to write beyond the ban. I was thinking particularly actually of Milton in the
Yeah.
17th century. I'm explaining to other listeners that he's a radical revolutionary English writer who pushed continuously against the threat of his writing being unlicensed. And he described writing, I think, as being like dragon's teeth, that it springs up everywhere and it becomes this, immensely powerful sort of instrument. That's in his essay Areopagitica. And it's amazing to think that writing, this old-fashioned thing, the books, can have a moment now in this way. It must be exciting being in the book business from that point of view.
Oh, it's immensely exciting. I also have to say, you're so speaking my language right now, Sophie. I spent a term at Oxford just studying Milton. I
Oh,
love
how
Milton
great.
so much. Yeah, I love
Yeah,
the rap.
he's
I love,
awesome. Yeah, I
yeah,
love Milton.
phenomenal. I love,
We should do a conversation about Milton sometime.
I would love that.
He's a shared passion. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Paradise Lost is extraordinary.
Oh my
It's
God, it's
it's in
incredible.
everything that I write. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also actually back to the topic we touched on earlier about how I loved your description of books as a technology that enable past, present, and future to merge and meet. It's a great description. It's what Milton does in Paradise Lost, incredibly virtuosically. He's working in deep time and he enables a kind of apocalyptic future to meet a present, to meet a deep past. And it's something I really felt in your writing. And I was thinking about this question, as you think of yourself now as, a small business owner, as a maker of literary objects, as a reader, as someone in conversation with other writers. What would you say is most energizing about it? And I guess I was thinking, is it this ability to bring past and future and present together? Is it just communicating with people who are looking for a way forward? Or something else that I haven't thought of? Is it that you offer free gift wrap? Yeah.
We don't actually.
Okay.
No, we sell it. Yeah, no, I honestly, it's I wake up every day and I get to converse with my elders, right? I get to
Yeah.
sort of speak back into the great and gorgeous, river of literature.
Mm,
And sort of and be in those waters also.
mm.
And it's accessible to everyone who can read, which is why literacy is so
Yes.
extraordinarily important, right?
Yes.
So and carrying around those. So this is the other thing too. Books, really good ones, get into you and get into your soul, right? So that you can walk around and you can sort of recite Milton to yourself. He's sort of whispering in your ear. You've got the ghosts of geniuses past in
Mm,
you as you live in the world, and then it mitigates the profound and existential solitude that we are all sort of given when we are born, right? It's
mm.
one of these, you have the ghost of geniuses with you at all times. And I love it so much because I'm not alone anymore. You know,
Yeah.
I don't have to be alone in this thought, in this time, because I know that other people have suffered other things worse and
Mm.
have written about it so that I can sort of cling to them and just,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I
It's a
think
great
often
description. Yeah.
it's extraordinary. I think of the Inferno all the time right now because I would like to put my enemies in hell.
Great call out. Dante's Inferno. Yes. I've yes, that's I love the shout out. So what I'm going to do is ask people, my students, if you'd like to put questions in the chat. We have just a few minutes left. Please do so. And while you're organizing your questions and putting them in the chat, I'd like to ask you, Lauren, we're talking about transformative books and we're talking about reading experiences that really change us. Could you name a couple of reading experiences that really have changed you, either recently or in the past, and also just in the books business? Some of the books that you think are really making a difference right now to people's
right
lives.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, the book that made me into a writer, and it's not one book, but it's all of them.
Yeah.
But the one that turned me to the page was Emily Dickinson's collected poems when I was 12 years.
Mm,
And I think she, I mean, obviously is such a profound genius, but it seemed accessible to me. Like,
mm.
I know I can't write like Emily Dickinson, but I felt like I could, or I could talk back to her. I could write something that's sort of speaking back to her. I just love
Yes.
it so much. Um,
Yes.
the person who consistently surprises me and makes me think about human life on a grander scale, on the macro scale, is Anne Carson. And she has a new book coming out, which is I'll go run and get it.
Yeah. Exciting.
Yeah.
While you're running and getting it, I was in Amherst, Massachusetts, a few weeks ago, which is for my students where Emily Dickinson's from. And I visited her grave. It was a very snowy day. There was a huge amount of snow. And I stood in this, I was going to say quiet graveyard, but there was actually a creaking of the wind in the way that you get on a very snowy day. And I noticed, I'm sure not, I'm not alone in noticing this, that she's buried opposite the African American graves in the graveyard. And it really spoke to what you're saying about Dickinson, which is that she steps across boundaries and barriers, and makes you feel that you can have this kind of deep connection with humanness in a different way. Yeah. You've got the
You
book.
know,
What's
I
the book?
chose I chose to go to Amherst College because of Emily Dickinson, because I got to go see
Oh,
the grave, and that's
that's right. Because the person who hosted me at Amherst I said that I was talking to you, and she said, "Oh yes, she's an alumna." Yeah, so great. Yeah.
So it's called H of H Playbook, and it's coming out, and it's like a scrapbook retelling of Heracles,
Oh
his life.
wow.
It's extraordinary. It's so weird, but I love her because she speaks better than almost anyone in a contemporary vernacular. But her eye rose over eons, right?
Mm.
She's just extraordinary. I think some people actually making like a political change right now in a really profound and joyous way are, I would say, Kaveh Akbar's his martyr from last year.
Mm.
Has changed a lot of people, in really deep ways. I think All Fours, believe it or not, which we talked about earlier by Miranda
Mm.
July, most of the 40 to 60-year-old women that I know who have read it have really, really thought through their relationship with their bodies. And
Yeah,
that's,
it definitely makes you think. Yep. Yep. It also made me think about renovation and that I needed to change my upholstery because there's that wonderful scene where she renovates her hotel room. Yeah.
That's so funny. I love
Yeah.
that. She would be pleased, I think, by that. It made me
People
think
were
of
very enlivened by All Fours. It's true. It's not a protest novel per se, but it women especially, I suppose, have found it incredibly energizing. Yeah.
it's a protest novel just because it returns the attention to the body as a site of ecstasy,
Oh, I love that.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I
Beautifully
think,
said.
anytime that we remember that we're animals,
Mm.
in animal bodies, it is revolutionary, right? It's turning against civilization and coming back to
Yeah.
uh, the truth.
Yeah. And let's finish with this nice question from one of my students, Camille. Any advice on creating immersive world building in writing? I know Camille is a singer. She's an emerging writer. And what's your advice on immersive world building?
Okay, Camille, I love this story so much. So, this question so much because I have a very real, tangible thing to do, which is every time that I'm trying to write a scene, the first thing that I do is sit and close my eyes, close all of my senses one by one, right? So you close the ears, you close the touch, taste, smell, everything. And you put yourself in the scene in one of the characters' bodies, the actual physical body. And then what you do is you slowly, one by one, open up each sense. And you start with hearing, because hearing is our least appreciated sense, right? So you listen. So if you're in the woods in 1610 and you're listening for the sound of water rushing under ice and bird song and maybe the trees creaking, you're listening to the wind, and then you slowly, one by one, open up each of the senses until at the very end you open up your eyes. And what that does is it centers you in the animal body so that the experiences that you're feeling can be charged emotionally with the setting and with where you are. Because you can have the same situation happen between the same people, but if it's on, a beach in the Caribbean versus on top of Mount Everest, it's going to roll out very differently, not just because of the landscape, but because the exigencies on the body, right? The needs of the body. So it's really important to come back into the body and to remember that we are animals.
That's incredible writing advice. I feel
It's
like
good.
we already had lots of good takeaways from this conversation, but that is an awesome little freebie for everyone. I'm internalizing that one right now. I said that was the last question, but this is, I hope, a quickie. But a lot of my students ask this question, so let's have it. You don't capitalize God, or the girl doesn't capitalize God, although she is a Calvinist, a Puritan. Anna Ferris is obviously very well informed because she says probably a Brownist. Um, why doesn't she capitalize God, Lauren?
Yeah, she's illiterate, but also, there's the book is telling the story, and it's very close to the girl's head, but it allows a certain amount of dramatic irony because the book and the girl are not exactly the same, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that the book knows that she does not, and she would never. So in some ways too, it's the book saying God as not capitalized is spreading the power of God out of the particular human aspect and idea of it and into a more worldly, more material, more, living and alive aspect of what God is. It's, I've been taken to task by lots of religious people about this book.
Have you?
Yeah, I don't care.
Yeah.
But I say to them, and I say, this is a deeply spiritual book,
Yeah.
just not a religious book, because religion is just a small interpretation of the vast and incomprehensible eternal truth that is God, right?
Mm,
Religion is small.
mm,
God is beyond the scope of human imagination.
mm.
And we create religions in order to try to explain something that we can't understand. So what I'm saying is to lowercase God is to bring God back into both the particular and also the more universal.
And that's a beautiful note to finish on because it really takes us to the title of the novel, The Vaster Wilds, which nominally are about the expanse of wilderness around her. But you're thinking about vastness in a much bigger sense, both in the book and beyond it. Lauren, you've been so generous. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've learned so much, and this was an even better conversation than the previous conversation, which I already loved. So it was a huge pleasure, and thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
everyone.
Yeah.
Be strong. Do not comply. That's all
Yes.
I'm
And
saying.
hopefully see you in the bookshop one day soon.
Yes. Oh, please. Yes.
Okay. You
Everyone.
take care, and everyone's saying
Bye.
thank you because it was splendid.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Sophie. Bye.
Bye. Bye, Lauren.